You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I spent 3 weekends rebuilding the deck on a small dock behind my buddy's lake house. We used pressure-treated lumber, stainless steel fasteners, and I sealed every single joint with marine-grade silicone. The good stuff, $22 a tube. 6 months later, I'm standing ankle-deep in water watching every one of those sealed seams weep like they were never touched. The silicone had pulled away from the wood on both sides, and I remember thinking, how did entire wooden ships survive years at sea when I can't keep a stationary dock dry for 1 season? That question sent me down a path I never expected. I started researching how the old shipwrights, the men who built the galleons and warships of the Age of Sail, kept their hulls watertight under conditions that would destroy anything we build today. And what I found changed how I think about every joint that has to meet water. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how they did it, step by step, from how they shaped the planks to the physics of why their method actually gets stronger when it gets wet. And stick around to the end, because I'll show you how to make your own version of their sealing material using hardware store supplies for your next outdoor project. Let's get into it. What we're talking about today is the traditional art of oakum caulking. It's arguably the single most important technique in the history of wooden shipbuilding, and yet most woodworkers have never heard of it. If you've ever struggled with sealing outdoor joints, keeping water out of end grain, or building anything that has to survive years of weather, this tradition has answers that modern products simply cannot match. So let me give you some context on the men who perfected this, because they deserve the credit. During the Age of Sail, roughly the 1500s through the 1800s, the shipyards of England, Spain, and the Netherlands were some of the most sophisticated construction operations in the world. We're talking about facilities that employed thousands of tradesmen building vessels that had to survive Atlantic crossings, Caribbean hurricanes, and naval combat. These weren't artists working in a quiet studio. These were production craftsmen under enormous pressure to build ships that would keep 500 men alive in open ocean. And within those yards, the caulkers held a special status. A master caulker was ranked at the same level as a master shipwright. In the Royal Navy dockyards at Chatham and Portsmouth, caulkers had their own guild, their own apprenticeship system, and their own pay scale. That tells you something. These men weren't doing grunt work. They were performing the single task that determined whether a ship floated or sank. The philosophy behind their work was fundamentally different from how we think about sealing today. We tend to reach for products that repel water, silicone, polyurethane, epoxy, materials that try to create a barrier between the wood and the moisture. The old shipwrights took the opposite approach. They used materials that cooperated with water, materials that actually improved their seal when they got wet. And that distinction, working with water instead of against it, is the core idea behind everything I'm about to show you. The first thing I learned that surprised me was that the shipwrights didn't try to make their hull planks fit tightly together. In fact, they deliberately left a gap. If you look at the cross-section of a properly planked hull, the outboard face of each plank, that's the side facing the ocean, has a bevel cut along both edges. This creates a V-shaped groove, running the full length of every seam on the outside of the hull. On the inboard side, the planks sit nearly tight against each other, but that outer bevel opens up a channel roughly 3/16 of an inch wide at the surface and tapering to almost nothing at the inner face. The species they used mattered enormously. English shipyards favored white oak for hull planking because of its closed cell structure. White oak has tyloses, which are tiny membranes that block the pores of the wood and make it naturally resistant to water penetration. Spanish yards often used live oak from their Caribbean colonies, which is even denser. The point is, they chose wood that could hold its shape in constant contact with water, and then they shaped that wood to receive the caulking material in a very specific geometry. This was the first thing that challenged my thinking. My instinct has always been to make joints as tight as I possibly can. But these men knew that a tight joint with no room for a sealant is actually weaker against water than a properly gapped joint with room for a material that swells. They were designing for the seal, not just the fit. Now, the material itself. Oakum. If you've never encountered it, oakum is hemp fiber that has been saturated with Stockholm tar, which is a pine tar produced by slowly burning the stumps and roots of pine trees in a kiln. The process of making oakum started with old rope. Naval yards had enormous supplies of worn-out hemp rigging, and this rope was taken apart by hand, untwisted and pulled into loose fibers. This job was often done by prisoners or workers in poorhouses, and it was called picking oakum. The loose fibers were then soaked in Stockholm tar, worked through by hand until every strand was coated, and left to cure until the tar penetrated deep into the hemp. Here's why this combination works so well. Hemp is a natural fiber with tremendous tensile strength and a strong ability to absorb moisture. On its own, it would absorb water too quickly, swell unevenly, and eventually rot. But the Stockholm tar does three critical things. First, it slows the rate of water absorption, so the hemp swells gradually and uniformly, rather than all at once. Second, it's a natural fungicide and insecticide, which prevents rot and repels marine organisms like shipworm. Third, it remains slightly flexible even after curing, so the oakum can compress and expand with the natural movement of the hull without cracking or crumbling. Compare that to modern silicone caulk. Silicone creates a surface bond with wood, but it doesn't penetrate the grain, it doesn't swell under pressure, and when the wood moves, the silicone either stretches until it loses adhesion or it tears. It's fighting the environment instead of adapting to it. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here's where the real craft comes in, driving the oakum into the seam. The shipwright's primary tools for this were a caulking iron and a caulking mallet. The caulking iron looks like a blunt chisel, roughly 8 to 10 inches long, with a flat blade about 1/8 of an inch thick at the tip. It's not sharp. You're not cutting anything. You're pushing fiber into a groove. The mallet is a beautiful piece of work in its own right, traditionally turned from lignum vitae, which is one of the densest woods on Earth, with a barrel-shaped head that weighs about 3 to 4 pounds. The oakum was rolled between the palms into loose strands called threads, each about the diameter of a pencil. The caulker would lay a thread along the seam, set the iron against it at a slight angle, and drive it into the groove with a series of controlled taps, not heavy blows. Controlled, rhythmic taps. The goal was to push the oakum down into the seam until it was compressed to roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of the seam depth, leaving room above for the paying compound. Here's what fascinated me. Experienced caulkers could tell by the sound whether the oakum was properly seated. A dull thud meant the iron was bottoming out against the inner plank edge and you were driving too deep, which could actually push the planks apart and open the seam from the inside. A sharp, ringing tap meant the oakum had good resistance and was compressing evenly. They called this hearing the seam, and master caulkers could work an entire hull by sound alone, adjusting their force plank by plank based on the density of the wood and the width of the bevel. Too little oakum and the seam leaks before the fibers can swell enough to close it. Too much and you create so much outward pressure that the planks distort. The sweet spot was typically 2 to 3 threads in a standard hull seam, driven to a uniform density. On a large warship, a team of caulkers might drive over 3 miles of seams, and the difference between a dry hull and a leaking one came down to the consistency of that compression across every single inch. This is the part that really changed my understanding. When that hull hits the water, the oakum begins to absorb moisture through the tar layer, but because the tar controls the rate, it doesn't happen all at once. Over the first 24 to 48 hours, the hemp fibers gradually swell, expanding against the beveled walls of the seam. This creates a compression seal that actually tightens as water pressure increases. The deeper the hull sits, the more pressure pushes against the oakum, and the tighter the fibers compress against the wood. This is the exact opposite of how silicone behaves. Silicone relies entirely on adhesion, the bond between the caulk and the wood surface. Increase the water pressure, and you're just increasing the force trying to break that bond. Eventually it fails. But oakum relies on compression, not adhesion. The water itself is what activates and strengthens the seal. A properly caulked hull could withstand hydrostatic pressures equivalent to 15 to 20 feet of submersion, which is exactly the range a loaded Galleons hull would experience at the waterline and below. This is why pirate ships and naval vessels could take cannon hits below the waterline and still be repaired at sea. The caulking system was designed to be redriven, patched, and maintained under the worst possible conditions because it was mechanical, not chemical. Once the oakum was driven, the final step was paying the seam. Paying means pouring a hot sealing compound over the caulked joint to protect it. The material used was pitch, which is different from tar, Tar is the liquid produced from burning pine. Pitch is tar that has been boiled down further until it becomes a thick, almost brittle solid at room temperature, but flows like honey when heated. Shipyard workers heated pitch in iron pitch pots over open fires, and a designated man would carry the pot along the hull while the caulker poured it into the seams using a long-handled ladle. The pitch served as armor for the oakum beneath it. It blocked ultraviolet light, resisted abrasion from barnacles and debris, and created a surface too hard and toxic for marine borers like teredo worms to penetrate. And here's a piece of history you'll appreciate. The longest and lowest seam on the hull, the one where the outer planking meets the keel, was called the Devil. It was the hardest seam on the entire ship to reach, and the most miserable to pay with hot pitch. That's where we get the expression, the devil to pay. It had nothing to do with Satan. It was a caulker's complaint about the worst job on the ship. Let me share some patterns I've noticed in my own work and in talking with other woodworkers. Things I did for years that the shipwright tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is trusting adhesion over compression. Most of us reach for a tube of something sticky and expect the bond between the sealant and the wood to do all the work. But the shipwrights understood that any adhesive bond to wood will eventually fail because wood moves. Compression seals move with the wood because the sealing material is trapped mechanically, not chemically bonded. The second pattern is making joints too tight for any sealant to work. I used to pride myself on joints with no visible gap. But if there's no room for a sealing material to occupy and expand within, you've actually created a joint that's more vulnerable to water than a properly gapped one. The third pattern is choosing materials that repel water. Silicone and polyurethane are hydrophobic by design. They push water away. But the shipwrights chose a hydrophilic fiber, one that absorbs water, and used that absorption as the sealing mechanism. Sometimes working with water is smarter than fighting it. The fourth pattern is the set it and forget it mentality. We want to seal something once and never think about it again. The shipwrights accepted that maintenance was part of the system. They inspected seams, red rove oakum where it had loosened, and repaid seams regularly. Their structures lasted decades because they maintained them, not because they used a miracle product. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start making better decisions on your next outdoor project. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. You can make your own oakum for outdoor woodworking projects, and it's simpler than you think. Go to a hardware store or a farm supply and buy a coil of natural hemp rope. Not synthetic, not manila. Natural hemp. Untwist about a 3-foot section and pull the fibers apart by hand until you have a loose bundle of strands. Then pick up a can of pine tar. Real pine tar, not the pharmaceutical kind. You can find it at farm supply stores or online for about $12 to $15 a quart. Work the loose hemp fibers through the pine tar by hand, wearing heavy gloves until every strand is saturated. Let it sit overnight on a piece of scrap plywood. The next day, you'll have a pliable, sticky, tarred fiber that you can press into any outdoor wood joint using a blunt chisel and a wooden mallet. I've used this on fence post joints, garden gate frames, and the seams on a cedar planter box that sits in full weather year-round. 2 years later, every one of those seams is still tight. It's simple, it's cheap, and it works exactly the way it did 300 years ago. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now, or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. These old shipwrights solved problems that we're still struggling with today, and they did it with hemp, tar, and a wooden mallet. Sometimes, the best technology is the one that already worked for 300 years. I'll see you in the next one.